In this video today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Ford 8.8 swaps and their advantages. And the main advantage, I guess, is strength, and the second advantage is going to be a wide array of gear ratios available. So you can pretty much choose whatever gear ratio you want. And then the third advantage is really cheap parts. You can get an LSD for these for $500 that's really strong, which is like the Eaton or Detroit True Track. And the swap that I'm doing today is this car behind me here, this BRZ with a 2J in it. So this car is making quite a bit of steam. So it has a little bit more power than that factory diff can handle. So I'm going to go through the whole process of swapping the diff and axles into this car and get it all set up, and it'll be running and driving at the end of the video. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to swap out the factory BRZ or FRS differential, which you see here, with one of my 8.8 kits. So the factory diff is pretty weak. They're pretty much identical to the Lexus IS300. So I'm going to go ahead and start by taking out this factory diff. So basically, this car has a 2J swap. So it's got an aftermarket drive shaft, so yours would look a little different. But basically, we're just going to remove the 4 bolts out of the drive shaft. And then the next step is going to be to take your wheels off, remove the axle nuts. They are a 32 millimeter socket, so you're going to need a very big socket. And I use one of my Milwaukee big impact guns to get them off of there. So after that, we're going to go ahead and drop this diff down and get these axles to slide out with the diff all in one unit. And I'll show you that once I get these drive shaft bolts out. Next step after the drive shaft bolts is going to be your 2 front mounts and your 3 rear mounting bolts. And of course, you're going to want to put a trans jack under here, or if you're doing this on the ground, you're going to have to probably bench press it at that point, or maybe use one of those little, they make a little ground scissor type jack for this kind of stuff, or you could even use a floor jack technically. So I'm going to go ahead and start getting this diff ready to pull down, and then I'll come back. So depending on what trans you're working with, in this case, the guy has a CD009 out of a Nissan 350Z. When you want to go to remove the drive shaft, you may want to just like leave the drive shaft in place temporarily, unless you have a slip yoke or a plug for the trans, because if I would pull this slip yoke out of the back of that trans, I'm going to get a puddle on my floor, and I want to avoid that. So I'm just going to leave the drive shaft installed for now. I will have to take it out eventually, because I'm going to have to get the drive shaft lengthened to fit this. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and drop the rear down. I'm going to leave the drive shaft in place just so I don't get a mess on my floor. Okay, so removing the diff, it's just going to be 2 19 millimeter bolts on the front mounts. So you can go ahead and pop them off. And you can go ahead and take both of them off. It's not going to fall because you have your 3 bolts in the back. So go ahead and take the front mounts out. And then we're going to go ahead and get the jack under here and get ready to remove those back bolts. Okay, so for the back bolts, these are 17 millimeter. As you can see, I have my trans jack here under the rear end so it doesn't just come flying down. And I'm going to go ahead and remove all 3 of these. The bottom one, you're going to have to get a straight wrench on it because it's behind that sway bar. But other than that, this is pretty straightforward. And we'll go ahead and drop this rear out with the axles. And I'll be back to show you the empty subframe. The diff is starting to drop down out, but the axles don't want to budge, and that's because they're in there. They're wedged in there. They're supposed to be like that. So you just got to give them a little persuasion to get them to start out. So that side, come around to this side, same guy. So now we should be able to slide this diff right down out with the axles in place. Okay, there it is. You can see that the diff is out with the axles. So next step is going to be to we're going to remove the spindles and get the wheel bearings out, because this guy is actually doing a set of Pro Level axles that I sell with the kit. And the Pro Level axles come with an upgraded set of wheel hubs, which have a heavier duty spline out here, because these spline are known to break and strip out with only like 600 horsepower. So the 1,000 horsepower axles have upgraded wheel hubs. So we're going to go ahead and get this entire spindle setup removed off of both sides. So now you can see with the diff out, you can see the bare subframe in here. And you can kind of see this guy had a little bit of an issue with the boot. All his axle grease came out of the boot and up through the car. So I'm gonna have to clean this up, make this look pretty. But we're gonna trim this as well in here to fit the 8.8 cage. Nothing structural will be harmed by that. It just needs a little bit of clearance to get the 8.8 in there. But other than that, we'll come back and I'll show you how to clearance that after I get this all cleaned up so I can get it prepped to cut. Just a short little note, this car is a little bit frustrating because it is so covered in oil. This has all been cleaned. This literally had a 1/4 inch thick of sludge. Like where that taper is right there was just full of sludge. I've been cleaning this with brake clean and towels and just wiping it down and cleaning it up. This was literally coated in here, a 1/4 inch thick of just mud, basically mud, but it's oil mixed with dirt, which turns into mud. Because this car had an oil leak up in the engine bay somewhere, which traveled the whole way back to here. You can see it, it's still dirty under the car. I'm gonna be cleaning this whole car for probably a full day to try to get this thing in good shape. But just a word to the wise, if you have an oil leak in your engine bay and you notice it dripping on your floor, get it fixed. It's gonna keep running back the car and just make a total mess out of your car. So proper maintenance is a must when it comes to especially a performance car. All right, so here's this FRS, and excuse the lighting in here, but I have the window open because I can barely breathe from all the brake cleaner fumes. But you can see here, I'm gonna flip this camera around so you can see a little better. But so this is it now. I took a break from this because I've been cleaning for about 2 hours straight now, but you can see here, I got the suspension pieces all cleaned up. The subframe is nice and clean, everything. Like, I normally wouldn't do this for anyone, but I basically am detailing the underneath of the car because it's just such a mess. But you can see here the difference between where I cleaned and where I didn't clean. So, you know, clean and not cleaned yet. I just wanted to show you the difference, but I mean, it's just, it was literally running the whole way up here to the front of the car. And if you look up under here, you can see the caked on sludge, and it's just, this stuff is all through my hair. You can even see it up underneath the intake manifold. So we got oil dripping off the intake manifold up there. It's just a total wet mess under here. So basically going above and beyond for this car just to make it decent. I mean, I feel like maybe I shouldn't, you know, some people might say it's just an FRS or whatever. It's not like a Supra like I usually work on, but I can't not do this. I mean, it's such a mess. So going through here, got this crap all through my hair, all over my arms. Went through probably 4 cans of brake clean and a roll of paper towels, a roll and a half so far. But it's gonna look good when it's done. At least it's gonna be nice and clean and not a total disaster underneath. But I'll be back to the 8.8 here shortly. Okay, so now we're actually back to doing some mechanical work on this now that some of the cleaning is taken care of. So what I'm gonna show you first here is I have the brake caliper and the rotor removed off of this wheel hub assembly. And if you look on the back side here, this is where the caliper would mount. 2 14mm nuts, they're easy. They pop right off. Might have to smack it with a hammer to get it off the rotor itself. And then in the back, there's 4 bolts. And you can see I removed 3 of them already. There's 4 bolts to remove the actual hub and bearing assembly. And then that's just a bolt-in piece. And over here I have the other side already removed, so you can see this unit. So there's 4 holes that come through the back like that. And then the e-brake shield mounts on this right here. So that can pop right off. So basically I'm just gonna pop this assembly off here and by taking that 1 bolt out, and then I'll show you how to get the actual hub, the wheel hub and the bearing assembly all out. So after you take the actual wheel hub assembly off, this is what you're gonna see here. So this is the e-brake shoes and the shield there, and they slip over this. It's just lightly on there, and sometimes it gets rusty and it sticks on there. So you're just gonna tap this lightly with a hammer, tap it out of this unit. So you're gonna hold this guy like this real sturdy, smack that with a hammer, and it should slide right out. And then you can just leave the e-brake assembly hanging or zip tied up there so it doesn't put too much tension on it for too long of a time. But that's pretty much it as far as removing the hubs. So now that I have the hubs both removed. The next step is to pound these studs back out so that we can put them into the new hubs. And as you can see here, these hubs, these upgraded hubs from Driveshaft Shop already come installed on the whole bearing assembly, so it's really nice. It's just a direct fit basically. Just takes a little bit of work to get the studs out and to put them into here. And when you go to remove them, you're going to want to use a nut on here so you don't bang up these threads when you go to smack them out with a hammer. What I do is I sit them down there on the floor, put the nut on each one, smack them out on that board, and then I'm going to go ahead and put them back in the other side. So I'll come back once I have the studs all reinstalled, and we'll go ahead and start putting the wheel hubs back in place on the car. So if you never pulled new studs in before, I'm going to show you how I do it. This is, I think, the simplest way. So you're going to take one of the studs, slip it through, and then you want to take a big spacer. I use a big nut that's bigger than the stud, so it slips right down over. And then I use another washer. And then I take a nut the same size, just like we used to pound off those studs, and I put it on here. Sorry, this is a little tough to do with one hand here, but take this, run it on. And then basically that helps center it, so it's going to pull on straight. And then just take your impact gun and slam that thing on there. So that's how I do it. It's the simplest, quickest, easy way. And you can see here I already got 2 installed, and you can see it pulls them up there really nice and tight without any issue. Okay, so here you can see the new billet hub is installed. Spins freely. Backside 4 bolts all tightened down. So the next step then is just to reinstall the rotor, put the brake caliper back on, and then this is ready for the axle install on this side. So I got to go back over to the other side there and do the same thing. And this car will be ready for the rear end install. The next step here is going to be to clearance the subframe. So I'm going to take this girdle assembly that I make for the 8.8. This is the same style girdle for the IS300, but for the BRZ, I use these longer studs as you need a little bit more length to get them through the bushings that are on the FRS BRZ subframe. So what you're going to do first is we're going to need to clearance here out on the right hand side where the cage hits. So what you're going to do is you're just going to take the cage itself and slide it under the bolts and get it back to where it's pretty tight. And as you can see, it's decent on the left side as far as clearing the hole there, but on the right side we are, let me get some light in here. On the right side you can see here that we're hitting right in there. So I'm going to go ahead and take a paint marker, and I'm going to go ahead and draw around here, and then I'm going to trim it out with a cutoff wheel. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll come back, I'll show you what I cut out, and we'll be ready to get the 8.8 up and in there now. So here's the lines that I came up with after having the cage up in there, the girdle up in there, and that's kind of, you can kind of see where I need to cut. And then in this area, the one support bar that was coming down looks like it's going to touch there. I'm going to cut this first, and I'm going to come back and look at this, but I might just have to tap that in slightly with a hammer to allow that to seat up against there tightly. But I'm going to go ahead and trim this out on the right hand side here, and then I'll be back and we'll go over this again. Okay, so now with the trimming complete, you can see how the cage fits back into the subframe, and everything is butted up tightly against there. I don't know if you can't really tell in the video, but everything is nice and tightly butted up against there, against the back bushings. So now I'm just gonna touch up these little edges here where I cut with some spray paint just so it doesn't rust. And then I'm gonna go ahead and start assembling the 8.8 so that it can go up in here. And that's really it. I mean, this is gonna be pretty quick from here on out. It's just gonna be basically bolting stuff in. These are the Driveshaft Shop Pro Level axles for the BRZ FRS. And as you can see here, these are the stub ends that are going to go into the 8.8. So when they come in the box, they have these already attached. We're going to take these stubs off because we're going to put those into the 8.8 rear. So you can see there's one and there's two. And then these are the billet outer ends that fit into our new wheel hubs that we installed and our new axle nuts. So basically I'm just going to remove these two guys, and I'm going to take them over here to my table with my 8.8, and you'll see here that the True Track comes with these spacers, a deeper groove and a thinner groove. So the first step in installing the 8.8 is to install the hairline groove spacer, but you only do that after we put the stubs in. So we're going to put both stubs in, we're going to slide that spacer down in here, and then we're going to put the cover in with the snap ring. So if you're getting one of these from me, if you're buying an actually completed 8.8, in this case, this guy did a Thunderbird 8.8, the cast iron case, which is the strongest 8.8 IRS. These will come separately. I can't ship them with this in there. Otherwise, when it's shipping, it could bounce around and get dislodged and possibly turn sideways in there, which you definitely do not want. Then your stubs won't go in. So when you get these from me, these will come in the bag separate from True Track, and you'll have to do this step yourself. It's pretty simple. I'll just go through it here in a couple minutes. Okay, so you can see I have my stubs removed from the axles, and here's my diff. And one thing I wanted to mention before we put the stubs in is these have brand new seals in here, so they are dry. So you do not want those dry when you initially start moving the car, because it's going to take a little while to get some oil in those seals. So always lube those up. You can pack them with Vaseline, or you can use, I use this assembly lubricant from ARP. So just lube those guys up, and then go ahead and install the stubs. Okay, so you can see my stubs are in, and you can see in there the stubs are coming through. You can see the ends of them there, the teeth, the splines. So now I'm going to install this hairline groove spacer, and it's going to go in like this. And I'm going to have to put this down so I can do this with two hands. I'm going to install this guy, and I'm going to install that cap with the retainer clip, and then this should be ready to go ahead and install the rear cover, and we'll go through that process next. Okay, so now you can see the spacers installed and the cover is in there with the snap ring, and the stub should have some play in and out. That's normal like that, but you should be able to feel them catch on that snap ring, which is normal, right? But they shouldn't be able to both push in to where they bottom out and bottom out on the seal. So that's normal. The way they look right there, that is totally normal. And you can kind of force them back and forth, but that's normal. So this is how it's supposed to be set up. And the next steps here are going to be to install the cover, set up the load bolts, and then after we set up the load bolts, we're going to take the cover back off, and we're going to install the cage assembly, and then this diff is pretty much ready to go up into the car. So this is the basic setup here. So we have the cage, which I've showed you already. Then what I haven't showed you yet is the cover, which is a cast aluminum cover. And you'll see here that I put a fitting in there for a breather, and then I weld a baffle on the inside. Basically, the reason I do that, the cover is going to be installed like this, right? So this is looking at the back. The oil is going to be spinning up from the bottom. So if you install it like this, the oil is going to be spinning up this way. So it's going to be going at a crazy pace, right? When you're going 80 miles an hour, think of how fast that's churning that gear oil up. So when it comes up, I'm trying to make the oil come up and over and miss this hole so it doesn't directly feed into that vent hole, which is going to be pushing oil out as hard as possible. So I put this baffle in here to try to kind of block that path of least resistance off the oil so that it comes up around, and then that way the vent just acts as a vent, not an actual exit for the gear oil. So the first step here that we're going to do is we're going to take the diff, and I'm going to slide it back here a little bit. I'm going to back the load bolts all the way out, So you can see these are the load bolts. And these load bolts, you can see they're all the way down. These load bolts push up against the main caps to keep them from egging out under extreme acceleration or on hard launches. So this just puts very light tension on here. It's just, you just hand tighten these. There's no torque spec. You just hand tighten them down till they actually touch. And then you tighten the actual locking jam nut. So right now I have them backed all the way out so I can fit this cover on. So I'm gonna put the cover on here now. I'm gonna put 4 bolts in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, just to hold the cover on temporarily so I can get the load bolts set up. And then I'm gonna pull those bolts back off because this isn't the final install of this cover. And we're not gonna silicone anything now as well. So the only thing we're gonna silicone is the load bolts, because those load bolts, we're gonna put a little bit on those threads so that those seal properly. Since it is just a thread in aluminum material, there's no actual seal there, so you have to use a little bit of silicone on the threads. And yeah, so we're gonna set the load bolts up, then take the cover back up, take the cover back off, and then we're gonna put the cage on top and do the final install with actual silicone sealant around the edge when we do the final install of that cover and cage. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started, and I'll be back when I have the cover in place with the load bolts. Now you can see I have the cover installed with my 4 bolts, so 2 on this side, 2 on that side, 20 foot-pounds, 20 foot-pounds on all 4 of these, just to get the cover in place so it's nice and flush and down to where the load bolts can be set up. Now the next step is to put some silicone on the load bolts themselves so they seal. So I'm just using some Permatex Ultra Gray. I took the nuts all the way back off, and I used a little Phillips screwdriver to apply the silicone back in there. So now all we're gonna do is we're gonna take these load bolts and we're gonna turn them in till they hit. Okay, so that one's in touching. Same with this one. Take it into where it's touching. Okay, and then I'm gonna just lightly tighten that with a wrench. Like I said, this is just hand tight, so there's no torque spec here. Hand tight it, and then on the load bolt securing nuts, they're 11/16. We're gonna put them in there and tighten them down so that they keep those load bolts cinched in place. So I'll come back. After this, I'm going to go ahead and remove the cover now after I get the load bolts set up and tightened down with the lock nuts. And now we can pull the cover back off, install the cage over top of the cover, and silicone the sealing surface of the diff and do the final install of the actual cage assembly. Here's the hardware that is provided with the kit. So these are the cover bolts. These are the ones I provide that have the taller height for the cage plus the cover. And these are the ones that come with the cover. So when you're installing the cover to tighten the load bolts, you use the short bolts, and then that's the last time you'll ever use these. Then these ones come into play here, these 10 black bolts. They are Allen heads for easier clearance around that cage, which is pretty tight. So these are what we're gonna use now. So here's the cover. Here you can see the load bolts are out to the point where they are actually touching the caps. So the next step here, I'm gonna put silicone sealant around the flange surface. I'm gonna apply the cover, and I'm gonna stack the cage on top, and I'm gonna work my way around with these bolts slowly and surely until I get 20 foot-pounds as a final torque on all of the 10 bolts. So I'll come back after I have the cover and cage final installed, and that's really it. The diff is going to be ready to go up in the car other than the front mount bushings. So I'll come back and we'll do that next. So the last step we're going to do here before we actually go to put the differential up in the car is to install these front bushings. And these are the Prothane brand, and I sell these, and I can provide these with a kit if you need them. And you can see here how they tell you to install these. So they want you to run this thicker side on the bottom. So this will go up through the bottom side. And then the thinner one is going to go down through the top. Like that. It's a little bit hard to do with one hand, but I'll put that on there. And then this guy, the sleeve slides down through there and retains those two together. And then you put one washer on top and one washer on bottom. And that's pretty much it. So I'm gonna go ahead and install these bushings, and then we'll be ready to put the diff up in the car. One other thing I like to do before I put the diff in, because it's just so much easier to do it this way, is to stand the diff up, and I use a little trick here. I use a roll of packing tape, and I stand the diff up. What we're gonna do is we're gonna put fluid in. It's so much easier now than trying to pump it up into the diff, since it's pretty tight with the subframe and everything. So pull the fill plug out. Now these diffs with this low profile cover, 1.6 to 1.8 quarts. I usually split the difference, 1.7 quarts in these Thunderbird diffs. So don't overfill them. That's just going to lead to more fluid coming out your vent from it being too full. So 1.7 quarts, and in the Thunderbirds I use 85-140, since these trans run a little bit, or these diffs run a little bit warmer because of the cast iron case. I run the thicker fluid. In the Explorers, I usually run the 85-90, just the regular non-synthetic gear oil. So yeah, I'm gonna fluid it up and we're gonna get it up in the car. Okay, so I'm going to raise this diff up in, and one other thing I wanted to do before I went to raise it up in is just attach a piece of silicone or rubber line for your vent, and I usually make it about 3 feet long. You just want to get it up in the chassis as high as you can, and what I usually do is I put a loop in it, so something like this. So I put a loop in it, I zip tie it there, and then I run it up to the highest point, the end of it, up to the highest point in the chassis I can get it to, and that keeps it from trying to push out as much as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and lift this up in and come back with the diff in place other than the front mount. We'll do the front mount last. Okay, so now you can see the diff is in place, and I put the 3 nuts that I provide in the kit. These are 3/4 inch size with 3 washers, and I just have them into where they're hand tight. You know, I want to be able to move them around. I still want to be able to have a little bit of wiggle room so that I can install that front mount. And you can see the diff fits up in here nice and snug. Everything clears well. Now, the one thing you'll see is, I don't know if you can tell, I'm gonna try to move the light in here. You can see how tight that is up in there to get that silicone line on for the vent. That's why I put it on before I installed the diff up into the car. So that's something to keep in mind. And what I'll probably do is I'll probably run this line up over the subframe and probably up into this area, like up in here, so it vents out here behind the tires. But that's it. I'm gonna get the front mount next. We're gonna install the front mount and then put the axles in, and this should be wrapped up. So this is the hardware for the front mount along with the front mount. So this front mount installs like this in the car. And these 2 outer holes are held in by these 2 Allen head bolts. And then these 2 longer bolts pass up through the bushings and into the front mount. And then these are some shim washers to get your proper level as far as the diff angle goes. And then these are the washers that come with the Prothane mount. So I include washers in case you're using the stock mount or whatever. I include these washers to work with it. But I might use these as well to kind of stack it up to get it to where I want it to be. I'm going to go ahead and put the front mount in place, and then I'll come back to the video showing you everything installed. All right, so the diff is up in, all tightened down, ready to go. So a couple things to point out before you go ahead and do this. Leave all the bolts loose and get them all started. So this one's gonna stay pretty loose. You're just gonna get it started, get a couple threads in there. Same with these guys, get them started and get a couple threads in there. Take notice to the washer stacking order here. I have one of my shim washers up on the top, then the Prothane washer, my small washer, and the bolt. And the reason is this only has about 3/4 inch of available thread, so you don't want to bottom that bolt out in there. You want to make sure you have enough so you only have enough thread engagement to not bottom that out and strip the threads out, otherwise you're gonna ruin that mount. So the way I did it was started this in, got a couple threads in, started this in, got a couple threads in, same on the other side. On the back, I left them fairly loose so I could move it forward and back to get everything in and in place. And then the first thing I did was I snugged these down just a little bit, like took them in a couple more threads so they had a pretty decent engagement. Then I tightened these back ones all the way up tight. So they were all the way in and tight, pulled the diff back where it needs to be. And then I went ahead and tightened up the bottom mounts all the way tight. And then the last I did these all the way tight. So just kind of like an order of operations to make things easy for you. So that's it as far as the diff install. Everything looks really good. So now the last step is going to be to install the axles, and then we're going to do the drive shaft last. So these are the Driveshaft Shop axles, and you'll notice that on these tags there is two different part numbers. GR is Grannas Racing FRS 88. The top number here is the 18.5-inch length, so that's the length, and here is 18 3/4 lengths. So one is a 1/4 inch longer, and the longer axle goes on the driver's side on these cars. So 18 3/4 is a driver's side axle, 18.5 is the passenger axle. So I'm going to go ahead and slide these up and into place, and we'll go ahead and bolt on the inner CVs, and that's it, we're done. So one thing worth mentioning here when you go to install these axles is you'll go to slide these up and in place, and you'll notice that there's no way to get that to fit in there. And that's because your suspension is all the way at the bottom of its travel, and that what makes the axle actually shorter in that position. And on this side, you'll see I was able to get that slipped in there. And the reason I was able to do that was I took my trans jack here and lifted up the suspension and got it up to more of the running position. So just be careful when you do this. This is the way I did it. Be careful if you're on a lift that you do not lift up too much to the point where you actually unbalance the car on the lift. You just kind of have to watch it as you lift it up. But on this side, I was able to get this axle in by moving it like this. So what I'll do now is I'll get this in and centered up. And then I'm gonna drop the car down off its suspension. You'll see the gap here is gonna go away. So now you can see that axle is pretty well locked in there. And then I'll slide this side stub over, and I'll do the same thing on this side, lift this side of the car up, and we should be able to have our axles in and ready to go. Okay, so now you can see I jacked up the driver's side, and before you saw how that axle wouldn't fit in there, but watch now. Easy peasy, up and in place. So now I can drop down the trans jack, and now our axles are in place and they're not going anywhere. They're not gonna be able to come back out now. Just gotta bolt them in, and the only thing left then is the drive shaft itself, and I'll come back and talk about that here in a bit. So one small issue I ran into here when I went to install these axles is I'm actually rubbing a little bit right up here on the subframe, on this like rainbow section of the subframe. The axle is actually rubbing right there. These things are so big around that they just touch right in this area. So I'm just gonna lightly clearance this with a hammer, just to get maybe 1/8 of an inch more clearance there so the axles can be free without any rubbing there. So it looks like that's the case on both sides here. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. It's not a big deal. I just, I don't want the axles rubbing the subframe cradle. Okay, so now with the very slight clearance work, which you can see right up in here, we now fit without any issue. Everything spins nice and easy. No rubbing. So I did that on both sides. It's just about 1/8 of an inch I need to tap up there. It's not a large amount or anything that's really bad, but I'd rather just do it this way than like do something like space the diff down, because I know my angle is pretty good now. So that's the proper way to do it. So that's what I would recommend. A couple things here, 85 foot-pounds on these. So use your e-brake and then tighten these down with a torque wrench to 85 foot-pounds. And then here I did the final install of the breather line. So you can see I put a loop in it here, zip tied it up so it stays nice and sturdy. And then I ran it up here, up high into the chassis as high as I can get it, where it'll breathe and also not try to flow out of there super easily. So that's basically it. Everything's in. I just got to do the drive shaft now, and let's go to that next. So let's talk about drive shaft. So here you can see this is a one-piece steel drive shaft the customer had for his CD09, and this is with the yoke smashed all the way in. So the yoke is all the way bottomed out in the trans, and you can see that this is probably about 1.5 inches of gap, maybe 1.75 inches here. So the 8.8 actually sits back about 1 inch further than your stock differential. So you're gonna need a new drive shaft. In this case, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna get this drive shaft lengthened 1 inch, which what it's gonna require is basically retubing it. So I'm gonna get this drive shaft retubed 1 inch longer. I also offer these kits with aluminum drive shaft from Driveshaft Shop for certain transmissions. So this one is a CD09 with a 2J swap, so it's kind of a unique setup. So I don't really have a predetermined length of drive shaft for this yet. I am going to take some measurements on it so that I can do this for future customers. But in this case, I'm just going to get this drive shaft retubed locally here, as the customer wants the car back as soon as possible. So the easiest solution, getting the drive shaft retubed 1 inch longer, and we'll be ready to go. One other thing I want to talk about in regards to drive shaft is drive shaft angle. So the one thing you want to do, there's a cool little video out on YouTube if you search for drive shaft angle, where they demonstrate how angle affects your U-joints and your drive shaft speed. And if you have imbalanced angles, how it can affect the drive shaft and make vibration. So what you want to try to do is line up your angles so that they are parallel. And what I mean by parallel is, so if your transmission is leaning downhill, like where the output shaft is, if it's leaning this way, then what you want to do is make your differential flange lean uphill. So so it'd be like here and here, so they're the same angle this way and this way, so that the U-joints spin at the same speed. So what you can do is get one of these little neat angle finder tools here, which they sell at Lowe's or Home Depot. And you can't really see it in this video, but this flange is 0.2 angle, so almost perfectly level. And then if you come up here to the transmission and you do the same thing, you're not gonna be able to see it, I don't think. 0.5. So these are both almost perfectly level, which is good. So that's what you want to do. You want to try to get them as close to the same angle as possible, so that you have less chance of vibration in the drive shaft. And the way you can change that is with these washers, or by spacing your transmission mount down to get your transmission to angle more, but that's a lot more work because you might have to change your intercooler piping depending on how much you change. The easiest way is to just angle the differential flange, and you can do that with this by adding more washers or removing washers to get that angle up or down, whichever way you need it to go. All right, so as you can see now, I have the customer's exhaust back on there. The drive shaft is installed and fits perfectly with the added length. This is a local shop that I had to do this drive shaft for me. They balanced it, retubed it for the added 3/4 length, 3/4 inch added length. So just a real simple shaft, steel, nothing fancy, just kind of going with what the customer already had and modifying it to make it work with the 8.8. But as you can see, everything is all fitted up here. I just got to put the rear wheels back on and this car's ready to rock and roll. So I found the source of the customer's leak, and that was the dipstick, which is normally right in here, was just free floating. It had some zip ties on there that were holding it in place. So you can see as I made a little bracket here and tigged it on. So that's gonna hold our dipstick from coming out of the hole in the pan, and it's gonna be held in right there by that AC bracket bolt. So I gotta put the AC bracket bolt back in and secure the dipstick. The other thing that I found was there was no O-ring on this dipstick, so I ordered one of those. And then the last thing I found was the valve covers themselves, the seals in those, the rubber O-rings that go around those were leaking pretty bad. So I replaced those as well. So this customer's car should be oil-free going forward and stay clean underneath now that it's pretty well cleaned up. So hopefully no more leaks, and I'm gonna go out here and take this car for a test drive shortly. So talk a little bit about the difference between the gearing that you had and the gearing now.
Okay, so gearing is a world of difference. I mean, we're talking coming from a 4.11 to a 3.27 is like, I'm talking like, I shift now at, I don't know, 5 to 6K RPM, whereas before I'd be shifting every, I don't know, 2 to 3K RPM from first to second to third immediately. I can't even make it to second gear. It takes me, I don't know.
So it's going through, it's a lot longer in each gear, basically.
Oh, absolutely. Each gear is a hell of a lot longer.
And it hooks better because it's less hitting the tire less hard.
Absolutely. It's actually allowing you to grab boost a lot longer, so you sit in boost, so you're not losing between each shift.
Cool.
So I mean, definitely. And the hooking's all there. I mean, as long as you got a good tire setup, then you're good to go. I mean, yeah, major world of difference. Absolutely 100% worth it.
Yeah, so this car went from a factory 411 gear down to a 327, which is a better ratio to go with the CD009 or the CD009 that's in it.
Yep.
So now this car has a similar gear setup to like what would be in a V160 Supra. Pretty close anyway.
Well, probably with a little less power than the Supra, but it definitely feels like just about driving a Supra. I mean, for the most part, yes, I'd say so. No 1,000 horsepower, but we'll get there soon. But it definitely is hooking really well with the power it does have, sitting at a little over 500 currently.